Hey y'all, welcome to our final episode of our Speaking Candidly conversational series where my conversational buddy Elijah Whitehouse and I will discuss and rant about varying topics from human nature to dating to entrepreneurship and philosophies. So today we will discuss the hot topic with regards to the power of sex, namely the psychology and construct of sex as something more than just a physical act of pleasure or mating. So, let's begin. The power of sex. Initial thoughts about it.
It's a thing. People like it. Sex sells, and there's a whole industry around it. It just speaks to that primal urge of people, and no one's immune from it.
Yeah, I guess in some sense, everything is about sex, right? That's what they say, hence the power of sex itself. And as that phrase they used to use, sex sells. Yeah, that's interesting to think about that. Like for me, my initial thoughts about it is the same as yours. It's just something that we've always known, and we're used to it. Like when we're born into this world, it's just something that
Yeah.
is innately within us as humans in general. In general. I guess moving on from that, that was pretty quick. I wonder when and why did sex begin to hold so much power beyond its initial context of it being a form of reproduction and a way to experience pleasure.
Just people being horny. that's that's really all it is. Um, just people being horny and or can't get it. They come up with some sort of construct to get some sort of satisfaction, and just it kind of blossomed from there. It just random off the top of my head opinion here.
Yeah, yeah, thinking like the same thing. Like I wonder when, but it's hard to define, right? Because it seems like it's such a human nature innate
Yeah,
thing. So defining when it began to take power is hard. I guess if we want to go into that, the when and the why. Well, the why obviously it's psychological manipulation in a positive sense that people don't think with their brains, they think with their dicks basically, especially when it comes to guys. So
yeah.
I guess someone somewhere noticed that and utilized that to their extreme advantage, and then it suddenly spread. The when, I would say, probably began with the advent of, I wouldn't say print. No, it could be print. The advent of print media is, again, it's hard to define. I had to do more research, but off the top of my head, I would say with the advent of print, it began there because when they, especially when they started putting pictures or magazines, stuff like that of attractive people, and they notice how those sell. Maybe that's when it sort of caught the attention. But of course, it probably began way before that. It's hard to tell.
I would make a bold claim in saying that when civilization first started, some concept of sex and power, would go hand in hand, and there may have been men back then who really wanted it and women who would take advantage of what they had to offer.
And I think
And
also it might be an animal kingdom thing, right? Where the men have to fight for the woman. So the woman, in some
yeah,
sense, is controlling the power. So the sex is the power because the
yes.
male, whatever species, have to battle each other or show off their feathers, whatever, in order to, be selected and chosen.
Yeah, I didn't take into account like species other than humans, but yes, that would apply.
It's such an interesting thing that to see something that is so pervasive in humanity as general, but it's still so unknown in terms of where or how it got to this point. You know what I mean? So it's kind of
Hmm.
like abstract concepts like death, life, consciousness, love. All those things
Time.
are abstract things. Yeah, exactly. That is, it's so pervasive, it's everywhere, but yet it's so hard to pin it down to a specific definition. We like the known, we don't like the unknown. So that's
Exactly.
interesting. Yeah, it's very interesting. Okay, so I guess let's go beyond the superficialities and into the notion of the power of sex itself. namely the construct of its power in seemingly innocuous events and even in everyday life. So, for example, I reckon that there's a phrase by Oscar Wilde that everything in the world is about sex except sex. Sex is about power. So, correlatively speaking, if we think about it, everything in the world is about power. What do you think about that?
One, I don't know who Oscar Wilde is. I've heard his name, but I have no idea who he is. So there's that. Two, yeah, I would say Oscar Wilde was correct in that everything is about sex, and sex is the activity. I think everything about sex is leading to having after sex, and then the sex who has control over it has the power.
Right. And just to
The
clarify, Oscar Wilde was from the, I think it's, I could be wrong, from the 1800s. I mean, I'll probably do a check later on this. So even back then, he made that claim, he made that statement. So he was observing human nature, which is interesting, So when he said everything in the world is about sex except sex, which is about power, to me, I see it as, well, that means in some sense everything in the world is about power. And most people, when they hear the word power, they deem it as negative, right? They see it as, oh, it's such a bad thing. You have to be mean to get power. But I don't see it that way. Again, it's a neutral entity, and power can come in many forms. It can be like personal empowerment, which is power. It can be actually attaining power, like as in political wise. It could be climbing this whatever social or corporate ladder. Those are attaining power. Or it could even just be financial power, anything. And again, it has a negative connotation, but it's just a neutral phenomenon.
Yeah, I would think with sex equaling power, it's also something to be celebrated. There are people today who celebrate, sex. It's something to be embraced and understood, and not like ostracized or demonized or anything like that. Like way back in ancient Roman and ancient Greek society, like sex was celebrated. Like I mean, the standards were different back then. Us as a society, we're like, oh well, women can't go topless because the boobies hanging out, and we can't have it, or don't be showing your butt crack everywhere. But we got people get blown up, just be fine, whatever. But we have an aversion to celebrating sex, and people who celebrate it, who are very sexual, are tend to be kind of like looked down upon for some reason.
Which I think can correlate to power being viewed as negative because, again, sex
Yes.
has a lot of power. If you use it, you don't have to degrade yourself to use it, but there are ways to utilize it that will lead to one's advantage, especially if you're a woman. Not to kind of boast my own gender or sex here, but yeah. So I guess when they do that, when these females do that, and they get berated, it's probably because of that. They feel, one, perhaps they feel intimidated. Number two, they feel like they're expressing too much of their power, which again is correlated to sex, so it's viewed negatively in that sense. Yeah, it's interesting. So going back to that phrase, there are some people that say everything in the world is a contract, is a negotiation, which, again, let's think about what's a negotiation. Is an exchange or an equilibrium of power.
Yeah.
So yeah. Okay, so let's dive a little deeper into that further about the power of sex. And I talked about how women can have the advantage here in terms of utilizing that. What do you think about that as a non-woman?
I think just people have a carnal craving for like sex. It's very rare that someone doesn't have a sex drive. For like asexuals. Myself, for example, I'm an asexual, so I don't have that sort of sex drive. So that doesn't really do anything for me. I don't have that sort of carnal craving. Intelligent people, maybe not so good people, um, would take would find ways to use sex to their advantage to further themselves or to
Right.
get what they want.
And you see, I don't think that we could blame them because, in some sense, They understand the game. They know how society and men or women sometimes work. So they're just playing it to their advantage, which is interesting, right? So again, that's something that's demonized, but at the same time, the ones who receive the benefit don't exactly point it out as a bad thing. Like, for example, the men who fall for that or who want that, they don't exactly point it out as a negative thing because they are receiving the gains from it, for example.
Then you have those people like serial killers who do sexual acts or who are sexual sadists, as part of their ritual killings and everything. So that's another reason why it's looked down upon.
Right, and that's interesting because, if we go behind the psychology of those types of killers, again, what the act itself is not a sexual act, it's an act of power. Like,
yes.
They do that because of the power. So back to Oscar Wilde's quote, everything in the world is about sex, except sex is about power. Which is interesting, yeah. So serial killers, I guess we can talk about that.
I was listening to a podcast that was talking about Jeffrey Dahmer and how he had killed like 17 or 18 boys over like a 10 or 20-year period. And one of the things he would do is rape them. And I was listening to other podcasts where rape was involved, sexual activity was involved, and it's about power and control, as we keep harping on. It's not really about the sex act, it's exerting power and control over that person.
Right, I think, so for these individuals, the allure to them is not the sex, it's the power in the form of how they express it. So perhaps when they were younger in their childhood, what happened was that somehow, somewhere, some event linked their sexual identity with a physical violent act, and that's how they become those kinds of killers. So okay, any ending notes or thoughts on the power of sex?
Sex is a thing and people like it.
That was simple. Well, I guess for me, I really believe, and I'm going to keep bringing up that quote, that Oscar Wilde's quote is very accurate. And he made it way back centuries ago. So it shows how human nature rarely ever changes. And again, everything in the world is about sex. And if sex is about power, then everything in the world is about some form of attainment, exchange, equilibrium, or loss of power. So that pretty much concludes our final conversation for this entire series. If you enjoyed this discussion or learned something new from us both, please go ahead and like and subscribe to this video and channel. Also, feel free to join in the conversation as well by sharing your thoughts in the comments. Again, we have all the other episodes up and saved in a playlist as well. So please, by all means, go ahead and check that out if you really like the content and style of our discussions. Now then, for the last time, and in this format, this is Vicki Lau and
Elijah Whitehouse
signing off.